Imagine standing on a tiny island in the Caribbean, while a massive hurricane destroys every single building around you. The year is 1772, and a 17-year-old boy is watching his world fall apart in the middle of the ocean. Most people would just try to survive, but this kid decided to write a letter about the storm that was so powerful it changed history. That letter was so good that the local leaders raised money to send him to New York, because they knew he was too smart for a small island. This boy was Alexander Hamilton, and he arrived in America with nothing but his brain and a massive amount of ambition. He didn't have a famous last name or a pile of gold, but he ended up building the very foundation of the United States. In this video, we are going to look at the life of the man who went from a penniless orphan to the face on the $10 bill. We will see how he fought in the Revolution and how he created the American financial system from scratch. We will also explore the massive scandals and the famous duel that ended his life way too early. There is a reason why people are still obsessed with him hundreds of years later, and it is not just because of the Broadway musical. Hamilton was a man who lived at 100 miles per hour, and he never seemed to stop writing or talking. His story starts on the island of Nevis, which was a place filled with sugar plantations and very hard lives. His mother was Rachel Fawcett, and his father was James Hamilton, but they were not actually married when Alexander was born. In the 1700s, being born out of wedlock was a huge deal, and it meant Hamilton was treated like an outcast from day one. His father eventually left the family when Alexander was just a young boy, leaving them with almost no money to survive. Then things got even worse when his mother got sick and died right next to him in their small home. Imagine being an orphan at age 12 with no parents and no money on a small island where everyone looks down on you. Hamilton had to get a job immediately, so he started working as a clerk for a trading company called Beekman and Kruger. This job sounds boring, but it was actually where he learned everything he needed to know about the world of money. He was counting bags of sugar and barrels of rum, and he was dealing with different types of currency from all over the world. He was also watching how ships came in and out of the harbor, and how international trade actually worked in real life. He was so good at his job that his bosses would sometimes leave him in charge of the entire business when they were away. But Hamilton didn't want to spend his whole life counting sugar, and he spent every spare second he had reading books. He read about history and philosophy, and he taught himself how to write with a level of detail that most adults couldn't match. When that hurricane hit the island in 1772, he wrote a letter to his father describing the horror of the storm in vivid detail. The letter was published in the local newspaper, and the people on the island were so impressed, they decided he needed an education. They literally took up a collection of money to buy him a boat ticket to the North American colonies so he could go to college. Hamilton stepped off the boat in Boston and then made his way to New York City right as the Revolution was starting to boil. He enrolled in King's College, which we now know as Columbia University, and he tried to finish his studies as fast as possible. But the air in New York was filled with talk of taxes and liberty, and the young Hamilton couldn't stay out of the fight. He started attending protest meetings, and he even stood up and gave a speech that stunned the crowd with its logic. He started writing pamphlets to argue against the British, and he did it with a passion that made people take notice. One of his first famous writings was called A Full Vindication of the Measures of Congress, and it was a massive hit. People couldn't believe that a college student was making better arguments than the most famous politicians of the day. When the actual fighting started in 1775, Hamilton didn't just stay in a library. He joined a volunteer militia called the Hearts of Oak. He spent his mornings drilling with a wooden musket before his classes even started for the day. He was eventually commissioned as a captain of an artillery company, and he proved to be a natural leader on the battlefield. His men loved him because he was always in the middle of the action, and he kept his cannons firing even under heavy pressure. During the retreat from New York, he caught the eye of some very important people, including a man named George Washington. Washington saw this young skinny kid who was organized and brilliant, and he realized he needed someone like that on his staff. In 1777, Washington invited Hamilton to become his aide-de-camp, which basically meant he was the general's right-hand man. Hamilton spent the next 4 years writing letters and orders for Washington, and he became the voice of the American army. He wasn't just a secretary because he was also helping Washington make huge decisions about strategy and diplomacy. Since Hamilton grew up in the Caribbean, he was fluent in French, which was a massive help when the French army arrived to help. He acted as the middleman between the American generals and the French officers, like the Marquis de Lafayette. Hamilton and Lafayette became best friends, and they both dreamed of winning glory on the battlefield together. But Hamilton started to get frustrated because he was stuck behind a desk, while other men were out winning battles. He constantly asked Washington for a field command, but Washington kept saying no, because he was too valuable as a writer. This tension eventually led to a big argument where Hamilton actually quit Washington's staff for a short period of time. He eventually got what he wanted and was given command of a battalion right before the biggest battle of the war. That battle was Yorktown, and Hamilton led a daring nighttime bayonet charge against a British fort called Redoubt No. 10. He told his men to empty their guns so they wouldn't accidentally fire and give away their position in the dark. They climbed over the walls and took the fort in just a few minutes, which helped force the British to surrender. After the war ended, Hamilton could have just gone back to a quiet life, but he was more worried about the country than ever. The United States was a mess because the central government was too weak to collect taxes or even pay the soldiers. Hamilton saw that the 13 states were constantly fighting with each other, and he knew the country would fail if things didn't change. He went back to New York and became a lawyer, but he spent most of his time thinking about how to fix the government. He married a woman named Elizabeth Schuyler, who came from one of the richest and most powerful families in New York. Eliza was a brilliant and kind woman who supported Alexander through everything, even when things got really messy. They eventually had 8 children together, and Eliza became the person who kept his life from falling apart. Hamilton was chosen as a delegate to the Constitutional Convention in 1787, where the leaders met to write a new set of rules. He wanted a very strong central government because he didn't trust the states to handle things on their own. He even gave a 6-hour speech where he argued that the president should serve for life just like a king. Most people thought that was a bit too much, but they still respected his brain and his dedication to the country. When the new Constitution was finally written, Hamilton knew it would be hard to get the people to agree to it, so he teamed up with James Madison and John Jay to write a series of essays called the Federalist Papers. They were supposed to write 25 essays in total, but they ended up writing 85 in just 6 months. Hamilton wrote 51 of those essays himself, and he often wrote them while he was traveling or in between legal cases. These essays are still used today by the Supreme Court to understand what the Constitution actually means. It was an incredible feat of endurance, and it showed just how much Hamilton was willing to work for his vision of America. Once the Constitution was ratified, George Washington was elected as the first president, and he knew exactly who he wanted for his team. He asked Hamilton to be the first Secretary of the Treasury, which was probably the hardest job in the entire government. The United States was basically broke, and it owed millions of dollars to foreign countries and to its own citizens. Hamilton had a plan to fix it, but his plan was very controversial, and it made him a lot of enemies. He wanted the federal government to take over all the debts that the individual states had run up during the war. This made the northern states happy, but the southern states like Virginia were furious because they had already paid off most of their debt. The man leading the opposition was Thomas Jefferson, who had just come back from being a diplomat in France. Jefferson and Hamilton hated each other almost immediately because they had totally different visions for the country. Jefferson wanted America to be a land of small farmers where everyone lived a simple and quiet life. Hamilton wanted America to be a global superpower with big cities and factories and a massive stock market. They fought constantly in cabinet meetings, and poor George Washington had to act like a referee between them. The argument over the debt was finally settled during a private dinner at Jefferson's house in New York. Hamilton agreed to move the capital of the United States to the South in exchange for Jefferson's support on the debt plan. That is why Washington, D.C. is located where it is today, and it all started with a deal over a dinner table. Hamilton then moved on to his next big idea, which was creating a national bank to hold the government's money. Jefferson argued that the Constitution didn't say anything about a bank, so the government wasn't allowed to build one. Hamilton argued that the government had implied powers to do whatever was necessary to run the country effectively. Washington eventually sided with Hamilton, and the first Bank of the United States was born in Philadelphia. Hamilton also created the Revenue Cutter Service, which we now know as the United States Coast Guard. He realized the government was losing money because people were smuggling goods into the country without paying taxes. He sent out small, fast boats to catch the smugglers and make sure the government got every penny it was owed. He was basically building the entire machine of the American government, while everyone else was still arguing about the blueprints. But as Hamilton's power grew, his personal life started to take some very dark turns that he couldn't control. In 1791, while his wife Eliza was away, he started an affair with a woman named Maria Reynolds. Maria's husband, James Reynolds, found out, and he started blackmailing Hamilton for money to keep the secret. Hamilton paid the money for over a year, but eventually some politicians started to suspect he was using government money for the bribes. To prove he wasn't a corrupt official, Hamilton did something that most people thought was absolutely insane. He wrote a 95-page document called the Reynolds Pamphlet, where he admitted to the affair in graphic detail. He wanted to protect his professional honor, even if it meant destroying his personal reputation and hurting his wife. It worked in the sense that people knew he wasn't stealing from the treasury, but it made him a laughingstock in the press. His political career never really recovered from that scandal, and he eventually resigned from the treasury in 1795. But even out of office, he was still pulling the strings of the Federalist Party and making things difficult for the new leaders. He had a huge falling out with John Adams, who was the second president and also a member of the same party. Hamilton wrote another mean pamphlet attacking Adams right before the election of 1800, which helped Thomas Jefferson win. But the biggest rivalry of his life was not with Jefferson or Adams, but with a man named Aaron Burr. Burr was a lawyer from New York who was just as ambitious as Hamilton, but he didn't seem to have any real beliefs. Hamilton thought Burr was a dangerous man who would do anything to get power, and he worked hard to stop him. In the election of 1800, Burr and Jefferson actually tied for the presidency, and the decision went to the House of Representatives. Hamilton hated Jefferson, but he thought Burr was worse, so he used his influence to make sure Jefferson became president. Burr never forgot that, and the tension between them grew for the next 4 years, until it reached a breaking point. In 1804, Burr was running for governor of New York, and Hamilton once again worked behind the scenes to make him lose. Burr found out that Hamilton had called him despicable at a dinner party, and he demanded an apology. Hamilton refused to apologize because he felt that everything he said was true, and he didn't want to back down. Burr challenged Hamilton to a duel, which was a common way for gentlemen to settle their differences back then. Hamilton actually hated dueling because his oldest son Philip had died in a duel just 3 years earlier. But he felt like his honor was on the line, and if he didn't show up, his voice wouldn't matter in politics anymore. On the morning of July 11th, 1804, they met on the cliffs of Weehawken, New Jersey, overlooking the Hudson River. Hamilton wrote a letter the night before, saying that he planned to throw away his shot by missing Burr on purpose. When the command was given to fire, Hamilton shot his pistol into the air and hit a tree branch above Burr's head. But Burr didn't miss, and he shot Hamilton right in the stomach, which caused a massive amount of damage. Hamilton was carried back to New York City, where he suffered in agony for over 30 hours before he finally died. The whole city went into mourning, because even though people disagreed with him, they knew he was a genius. His wife Eliza lived for another 50 years after his death, and she dedicated her life to preserving his legacy. She collected all of his writings, and she started the first private orphanage in New York City to help children who were like him. Hamilton's vision for America eventually won out, because we became a nation of banks and businesses and global power. He was a man who came from nothing and used the power of his words to create a world that we still live in today. He was flawed and he made a lot of mistakes, but he never stopped working for what he believed was right.
Thank you for watching. Please like,